Hello everyone, this is Professor Hasselman, and in today's lecture we're going to talk about the ending of the American Revolution and the War for Independence, and then talk about the creation of the new republic. And the question we're going to be asking now is what to do now that the war is over. And we've already talked a little bit in class about our rights as American citizens and whether or not the revolution was really revolutionary. But now we're going to be talking about some new things that America did that was different from other parts of the world. It may not be 100% original, as we did have republics in Rome and we did have a republic system in England for a while, but one of the things that we're going to be doing is creating a Republic of the United States, a republic, the Great American Republic, and we're going to figure out how we're going to organize this. So after the revolution, the governmental lesson many Americans initially drew from their experience with the British was that concentrated power in the hands of monarchy or executive authority was not desirable. So we saw in England what happened when the monarch had too much power, in a way formed what Americans saw as a tyranny. So we're going to be looking at what we decide to do. Now, in writing constitutions after independence, which remember I mentioned in class how a lot of the colonies had charters, so some form of government in place with the king usurping power as the revolutionaries felt. But in writing constitutions after independence, many states created governments with a weak executive. Pennsylvania went to the logical extreme of eliminating the office of governor altogether. If we don't have a strong executive, then we don't have to worry about too much power being concentrated. Now, some members of the elite, such as John Adams, worried about the democratizing tendencies inherent in these radical state constitutions. Because if you're taking away the power of an executive, then who are you giving the power to? Now, men like Adams worried about the judgment of ordinary Americans and wanted to limit the franchise or the right to vote through property qualifications for voting. And if we think about our right to vote today, the only thing you have to do is be 18 years old and register to vote. So you've come a long way from the time of Adams. Now, why would he do this? And we'll talk about this a little. He also, this is John Adams, he also advocated a system of mixed state governments with a bicameral or two-house legislature, similar to how we have it today with the House of Representatives or an assembly and the senators. He wanted an elective governor with veto power and appointed judiciary. So he's looking at three different branches of government here. New York State adopted this system in their state constitution. So these are some of the things that we're looking at when we're looking at the writing of state constitutions. Now, the desire for limited central government shaped the first Constitution of the United States, known as the Articles of Confederation. So our first legal form of government was the Articles of Confederation. Now, there were some limitations to this. There was no executive or judiciary branch, so basically no president and no court system. There was a unicameral Congress, with all states having one vote each. So what this means is we have a Congress, similar to what we have today, but instead of having a House of Representatives and a Senate, we have one Congress. And if we think about how government is organized today, each representative has a vote and represents a certain region of the United States, and each senator has a vote. Now imagine if we just decided decisions in the United States where all 50 states had one vote per state. And you can imagine the difficulties of getting anything done that may occur in a system like this. Congress was given limited authority. It could only declare war. It could make treaties, international treaties. It could settle disputes between the states. It can borrow and print money. And it could requisition or ask for funds from the states. And the central government could not levy taxes. So very limiting into what the Articles of Confederation could say the federal government could do. Now the Americans won the Revolutionary War despite, not because of the Articles. And that's one thing to remember is while the Revolutionary War was happening, the Articles of Confederation were governing the United States. But it was not because of them that the war was won. Now, the Articles also resulted in an overly weak government after the war, and it was unable to respond to problems abroad and at home, as witnessed by Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, which you read about in your textbook. Now, a lot of men got together and decided that there was a problem with the strength of the Articles of Confederation, that this was very limiting to what can be done. And as we saw in Shays' Rebellion, one of the reasons is once the rebellion started and Massachusetts asked for men to be sent and an army to be raised, the government had to ask the states for money, and the states could refuse. So there was a lot of weakness in what was happening with this Articles of Confederation. Now, a group of men decided to meet in the summer of 1787 as what we call the Constitutional Convention, and a bunch of delegates got together to decide how can we fix this system. Now, there was lots of divisiveness on whether or not they should change it completely or keep it going, but there was a problem and things needed to be solved. So the men who met in the summer of 1787 were once again men of property and education from the elite. James Madison arrived at this convention with what we call the Virginia Plan. And in his plan, he proposed replacing the Articles with a strong central government. Now, you can imagine a lot of other delegates thought that this wasn't necessarily a good way of doing things. Now, another plan that was proposed, remember these men are being held in the convention center, in the convention room, and they're doing this all secretively, and they're coming with their different constituents' ideas of how the government should be organized. So the two main plans, as I mentioned, one was the Virginia Plan, and the second plan that came about was known as the New Jersey Plan. And one thing to remember here is that Virginia is a lot bigger than New Jersey. One is a northern state, and one is a southern state. Now, the New Jersey Plan proposed amending the Articles only, and it was rejected in favor of the Virginia Plan as the basis for further discussion. So, in other words, the New Jersey Plan wanted to just revamp the system, while the Virginia Plan wanted to throw out the Articles and start over. Now, along with the other debates that were going on in Congress, there were lots of divisive issues aside from throwing out or keeping the Articles. One was the idea of slavery and representation, and the other was representation of small states. So how do we represent the slaves if we're going to have a representative system, and how do we represent small states that don't have as many, as large a population as the larger states? And a compromise was struck during this time known as the Great Compromise, which dealt with the slavery in this way. It made what was known as the 3/5 Compromise, in which each state counted for representation 3/5 of their slaves. So that deals with the overpopulation of slaves in the South. And the other part of the compromise was that small states would have equal representation in the upper house. So we're going to have two forms of a cameral system, so two houses. One is going to be based on population, which is our representatives, which is our House of Representatives, and the other will be based equally, which is our Senate. So the upper house will have equal representation, so no matter how small or how large your state is, you get two each, or one at first and then two later. But the size will be determined in our House of Representatives. But what the compromise basically started was the idea that slaves aren't worth as much as a regular person. So we didn't have to worry about these large states that had lots of slaves having too much power in the House of Representatives, because their population is based on the whites and 3/5 of the slaves. Now, in this new idea, Congress had a couple more powers. Congress could tax and regulate interstate commerce, and they would have an executive or a president who would have veto power and would be chosen by electoral college, which we'll talk a little bit more in class. And a judiciary was established, but not organized or defined. So this compromise and this constitutional convention created our three-branch system of governing that we have today. An executive with certain powers, a legislative or Congress with certain powers, and a judiciary whose powers will be defined later, which basically is the foundation of our constitutional system today. Now, in ratifying or voting on whether or not to have the Constitution, we have what we know today as kind of the birth of our party system. We had those that favored the Constitution and those that didn't favor the Constitution. Those who didn't were known as anti-federalists, and those who did were known as federalists or nationalists. Now, anti-federalists were probably a very slight majority of the population, and they feared the strong centralized power of the new Constitution. It looked like it was giving too much power to the federal government. Now, many of the federalists, or nationalists, were much better organized than the anti-federalists, and in their organization they wrote what was known as the Federalist Papers, which was organized by Madison and Alexander Hamilton, two of the strongest Federalists at the time. In this Federalist paper, one of the most famous of these papers, known as Federalist Number 10, it argued that the size of the United States would prevent any one interest group from becoming too powerful. So it was kind of an argument for the Constitution and the argument against the anti-federalists that this would create a too strong of power of the federal government. So all the different interest groups and all the different factions would keep the power away from the federal government. So we didn't have to worry about that. And the power would reside maybe in the states, perhaps. Now, the ratification process was stacked in favor of success. State legislatures, cut out of ratification process to avoid their strong opposition, and only 9 of the 13 states needed to agree for ratification. And one of the things that the ratification process did was it created a separate ratification convention. So instead of the states forming their own different groups and their own decisions, a separate state legislature was formed to okay or ratify the Constitution. So it immediately removed the power from the states and kind of stacked it in favor of the federal government. Now, many of the states, especially the anti-federalists, like I said, feared too much power from the federal government. So a promise was made to add a Bill of Rights that would help secure the final ratification by June of 1788. So during the process, there was lots of compromise made, lots of decisions that were made. And one of the things that we're going to learn in this class as we move forward is that compromise doesn't really solve anything. It kind of basically puts a bandage on a wound, and the bandage will eventually fall off or need to be replaced. And this starts right at the very beginning of the formation of our United States, this idea of compromise. The compromise with the slaves, the compromise with the states, and the compromise that we'll make to allow, to prevent a government from becoming too strong. So what happens next? So we're going to talk a little bit about what happened after the formation of the United States and the creation of the Constitution, and look at this new republic that was created. Now, the U.S. Constitution left many details undecided, which we'll talk about in class, which also became the business of the new national government in its early days. So not only did they have to govern, but they had to figure out what we need to do with these undecided decisions. We're going to have a Bill of Rights, which meant to provide explicit guarantees of personal liberty. 19 amendments were proposed, and 10 were adopted and ratified, which we'll discuss in class. In 1789, in response to what exactly the judiciary or the court system was going to do, Congress passed what was known as the Judiciary Act. So this is an act of Congress, which, remember, acts can be repealed. It organized a federal judiciary. It established district courts, appeals courts, and a Supreme Court. So whereas the Constitution says there will be a court, this is the third article of the Constitution, there will be a court, the Judiciary Act organized them. And this is what's called an appellate court system. So we have a system, levels of courts, from a lower court, maybe in a county or city, then a state court, then maybe we've got some district courts, and then we've got appeals courts at the top that listen to problems that the lower courts bring to them, and then a Supreme Court which continues this listening. And the federal judiciary's actions were tentative at first, so we weren't quite sure what we're going to be doing with these decisions that the court decides. Now, our first president, George Washington, he was the first of his kind, and he had great freedom in organizing the executive. Now, the Constitution clearly states what the federal government and the executive, what his powers are and what he can and can't do compared to the other balances of power. But he did have some leeway in what he could do because remember, he is starting from scratch. This is something brand new that no one else has ever done before. So he had great freedom in organizing, and one of the things that he did was he organized his administration with precedents in mind. So what he did was he looked at he goes, I am George Washington. I have a great leader. I am a general. I know a lot about military, but I may not know that much about economics or fiscal policy or social issues or dealings with the southern states. So in doing so, I'm going to gather a bunch of experts together, and I'm going to create what George Washington called his cabinet. And I'm going to create this cabinet with all these professionals within my reach that are going to be able to help me to make these decisions. Now, remember, this is not a constitutional thing. It does not say you must do this. It's something George Washington set as a precedent. Now, one of the things that Washington did was he named Alexander Hamilton as his financial advisor, his Secretary of the Treasury, as we call it. Now, Hamilton was a cynic, but enjoyed a very warm relationship with Washington, which means he kind of didn't really trust people very much. He had been his aide during the war, so it's just a friend that he knew and someone that he trusted to be at his side. Now, one of the things that Hamilton realized as this new financial Secretary of the Treasury was that the U.S. finances were in very bad shape. The U.S. debt at the time in 1789 was $54,124,464.56. So we'll say about $54 million. And in trying to figure out what to do and how to fix this debt problem, Hamilton tried a couple different things. First, he published a report in 1790 known as the Report on Public Credit. And this was his plan on how to deal with this money. So what Hamilton did was he proposed assuming state war debts, that the federal government would take the debt of the individual states and take all of that debt onto its own and combine them with the U.S. debt and then issue new bonds to cover both. So in other words, they would take this money basically what happened was that they take all this money in these bonds and then individuals would purchase that bond and interest would accrue and that money would now go to the government. So basically they take the debt and they would sell the debt and then people would invest in their government. And what he wanted to do was he wanted to give investors more incentive to support the new government. Okay? And states with large debts obviously supported Hamilton, and states with small debts did not support Hamilton. They're like, well, we can pay it on our own. And large states are like, well, we need help, so take all of our debt. So that's the first thing we did. And the one reason he wanted to do this was if people invest in our nation, then they'll want to see things work and they'll want to see the government work. And notice what he's looking at are investors, the people making lots of money. And the majority of these people making money at the time were either slaveholders in the South or industrialists in the North. And one of the things he actually focused on the most was dealing with these industrialists in the North and how to get them to invest in the federal government. Now in 1790, shortly after his first report on public credit, he issues a second report. And in this report, Hamilton proposes that Congress should charter and invest in a bank to promote manufacturing. The bank would issue loans to American merchants and bills of credit and serve as a repository of government revenue from the sale of land. And then stockholders and federal government would now own the bank. So please invest in our debt, and we're going to put it all in a bank. And then the way he said that this was legal, and this is the tricky thing about Hamilton and others and Jefferson. We have these two groups of people, Hamilton, which says the Constitution says this, and what it really means is this. And then we've got others like Jefferson who come in later who say, no, the Constitution says this, and it means this, exactly word for word. And one way that Hamilton defined and kind of said it's okay to have this bank, even though the Constitution says nothing of it, was he focused on Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which granted the government implied powers. that gave the green light to his programs. So there are all these powers that the Constitution has, and then there are other implied powers. And one of those is to make sure that we have a good, strong financial system. And again, this is the difference between strict versus broad construction. So Hamilton would be a broad constructionist, and Jefferson later would be what we call a strict constructionist. Now, his last report that he made during this time period was what was known as the Report on Manufactures in 1791. And he realized that there were some issues in the United States would have to catch up with where Britain was, one of the most industrialized nations of the world at the time. And one of the ways that he did this was he said, okay, if we want to protect our trade, then we need to make sure that we trade with ourselves, and we make sure that it's harder for other nations to trade with us. So we will boost the amount that we can trade. So Hamilton proposed a protective tariff. And what a protective tariff does is it prevents, it makes it harder for other people to export and import stuff to the United States, and it also makes it harder for us to purchase those goods because the price has gone up. So it's basically buy and sell American. He also proposed federal subsidies to American industry, which makes sense because if we give them more money, then they can invest in factories and they can continue their development. Now, the problem was the idea was rejected by Congress, which was dominated increasingly by James Madison and his followers, who adopted a tariff to fund the national debt and current government operations. Okay, so this was kind of an issue that Hamilton had to deal with. These other people that didn't want to put these tariffs in play and wanted a little more free market, as they would call it. Now, the debate over Hamilton's economic problem helped create a political division. Now, we have some domestic reasons, some foreign reasons, and then some problems with Washington leaving. Now, Hamilton, Adams, and other Federalists wanted to promote more manufacturing back at home. Okay, this was the domestic issue. Now, Jefferson, Madison, and other followers called Republicans, these are the anti-Federalists that later became the Republicans, felt the stability of the new republic required the U.S. stay mostly agricultural. So we have the Federalists who were looking at industrialization as the way that America would move forward, and we have the Republicans, on the other hand, who looked at, no, this is a nation founded by farmers, and we need to look more at the rural agricultural society. They are the true backbone. So the Federalists, led mostly by Hamilton, said industrialists were the backbone, but Jefferson and others, the Republicans, felt that farmers were. Now, looking at foreign policy, the division was mostly over the French Revolution. Now, started in 1789 and growing increasingly radical in the early 1790s with the execution of the French King Louis XVI, France emerged as a republic. So we have the American Republic, and now we've got the French Republic. Now, the Federalists were uncomfortable with the radicalism of the French Revolution, and they feared that the radicalism might infect the minds of Americans. Because we had just fought a Revolutionary War, they fought a Revolutionary War, we were brothers in revolution, and the Federalists feared that would come over here to the United States. Republicans, on the other hand, tended to be a bit more sympathetic, and they were optimistic. And they saw it as the revolution as a necessary evil of eliminating monarchy and aristocratic culture that supported privilege. Now, each faction was suspicious of the other as plotting against liberty, and Washington, during this time period, declared the U.S. neutral in war that later developed between France and Great Britain following the French Revolution, and which would lead us into what is known as the Napoleonic Wars. So we have this division between the Republicans who said we need to support our French Republicans back in France, and we've got the Federalists who are saying, but if we support them, that might cause radicalism here in the United States. Now, Washington, being a patriotic king as we call him, although sympathetic to the Federalists, Washington was able to largely stay above the divisions on the basis of his reputation. So he did not get involved in this division between the two different political groups. Now, in reaction to some of the problems that were going on in France, in 1790, the United States initiated what was known as the Naturalization Act, which said to be a citizen of the U.S., an immigrant had to be a, quote, free white person of good character. So to be a citizen of the United States, you had to be a free white person of good character, whatever that means. So this, of course, excluded slaves, free blacks, Indians, and Asians, and basically created what we call a republic of white men. Now, who could vote? According to this naturalization, only male property owners or taxpayers. Women would vote only in New Jersey until 1807, which again was restricted only to free white males. Now, there were lots of issues that this new republic faced, and one of the things that they realized was that the creation of this strong centralized government, it's not centralized, but this strong central government, did help things that happened in the past. So when we had Shays' Rebellion to show how weak the Articles of Confederation were, a Whiskey Rebellion that erupted shortly after the signing of the Constitution and the creation of the Republic showed how strong the government was to put down these problems. Now, following Washington's second term, and he declined to run for president again in 1796, Adams prevailed over Jefferson in the Electoral College, with Jefferson becoming vice president under the rules of the time. So now today when a president runs, he chooses a running mate. In the past, whoever lost the race, which they can become quite bitter, became the new vice president. So that can cause some problems in the early republic. Now, one of the main problems in Adams' administration was how to deal with this conflict with France. Now, in 1789, a French diplomat, an intimidation caused by a diplomat, caused some outrage in the United States. Basically, there was some bribery that went on between a French diplomat and an American diplomat, known as the XYZ affair. And the Federalists saw the French as untrustworthy and couldn't be trusted. Now, this led to what was known as a war between France and the United States, known as the Quasi-War. We weren't really at war with them, but we were at war with them. And it was what we call an undeclared naval war between the U.S. and France and the Caribbean, mostly over this affair known as the XYZ affair. We can't quite trust the French, so now we have to be careful. Between 1797 and 1799, 834 ships were seized by the French. Now, Adams urged the buildup of the U.S. Navy, which, if you could believe, at this time consisted of only a single vessel at the time. And to continue this fear we had of the French, in 1798, Adams passed what was known as the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were 4 laws, the most important being the Sedition Act, in which Federalists essentially tried to outlaw Republican criticism of Adams' administration. So basically, if you say anything bad about our administration, then you can be arrested. Which of course raised several constitutional issues, especially the idea of the freedom of the press. Now, the Republicans, the opposite, who were opposed to Adams and his followers, saw this as evidence of the Federalists attempting to squash individual liberties, and the growing of the federal government would crush states' rights. So you have all these issues going on. We've got this conflict with France, the Alien and Sedition Act. It seems like the federal government becoming too strong, too powerful under the control of Adams. So following this Alien and Sedition Acts and other attempts at taking away our freedom of speech, Jefferson and Madison found a way to criticize the Federalists while avoiding arrest for sedition. And they proposed that the states could nullify unconstitutional laws like the Sedition Act. So Congress can pass laws, but being a federal system that we are, a mix between state and federal government, Jefferson and Madison believed that Virginia and Kentucky, their states that they represented, could nullify or annul these laws if they found them unconstitutional. And remember, this is before the famous Marbury versus Madison case, in which it was decided that the Supreme Court's role is to do this. So things are looking a bit shaky for our early republic. Now, in 1800, we had a rematch of the 1796 election with Jefferson challenging Adams. So before they challenged each other, Adams won, Jefferson lost and became VP. In this election, Jefferson runs and challenges Adams once again. Now, this was one of the most controversial and bitter elections in American history, and it also revealed a weakness in the Constitution in 1787. Now, the initial results of the Electoral College showed that Jefferson and Aaron Burr tied, throwing the election into the Federalist-controlled House of Representatives. So if two people run for the position and they tie, the House of Representatives makes the decisions. 35 ballots were produced, and no winner was found until several Federalists changed their votes, electing Jefferson. Now, the challenge supposedly came from Alexander Hamilton's influence. So this Federalist swayed the votes. Now, the election eventually led to the 12th Amendment, which mandated running mates be voted for on one ticket. So instead of the VP and the president back and forth, opposite sides, an amendment was passed, and it was the 12th Amendment, which said that now the president has to choose their own running mate. Now, in the election of 1800, Jefferson takes over. He prevailed over Aaron Burr in the House of Representatives, and it led to the 12th Amendment joining the vote for the president and vice president. Now, Jefferson's inaugural took a conciliatory stance towards the Federalists. His agenda: cut government spending, eliminate internal federal taxes and pay off the national debt, a passive approach to economic policy, and a selective removal of Federalists in appointive offices. Only 69 of the 433 were allowed. So basically, we're going to remove some of the Federalists that Washington and others put in place, and we're going to replace them with something else, and really cut the government spending while lessening the amount of positions available. In 1801, Republicans repealed the Judiciary Act. The Judiciary Act of 1801 basically packed the judiciary with Federalists, which was repealed by Republicans. Republicans failed at using impeachment to remove the Federalist judges, and they were unable to oust arch-Federalist Samuel Chase and others. Then in 1803, a decision was made by Jefferson to refuse the commission that Adams left for some federal judges. Now, one of these men that was supposed to be the Justice of the Peace in Washington, D.C., named William Marbury, was not given this position. Jefferson said, "No, I'm not going to have you be my Justice of the Peace." Now, he petitioned the Supreme Court for an explanation from the Secretary of State, James Madison. Now, what happened was that Marbury takes Madison to court and asks the Supreme Court, what are we going to do about this? Now, Marshall, who is the Supreme Court Chief Justice, he found that the Judiciary Act of 1789 was unconstitutional, and that the Constitution did not allow Marbury's case to come to the Supreme Court. So the Judiciary Act of 1789 set up the constitutional system, set up the judiciary system, but the Constitution never said that that's what the Supreme Court's role was, to hear these cases. And what happened was, he said, okay, here's what the Supreme Court's job is. The Supreme Court's job, according to this Marbury versus Madison court decision in 1803, was to make the Supreme Court's job to be what's called judicial review. It's the Supreme Court's decision now, and this precedent is set, Marbury versus Madison. The Supreme Court's role is to listen to the decisions and all the testimony from the lower courts, and then make its decision based on the court reviews and the court cases. So it's not the Supreme Court. You can't say, oh, I'm upset with this issue. I don't think I'm being treated very fairly personally. I'm going to go to the Supreme Court first. What this decision made and what Marshall decided was that no, Supreme Court is the final court after going through all the different courts to get up there. And once all those courts hear and you appeal all the way to the top, once the Supreme Court makes this decision, that now becomes precedent. And this is now the new, the foundation of our new system of court systems. So all this starts to take place under Jefferson's presidency. Now, also under Jefferson's presidency, we start to move further west. And after 1783, this starts to spread out. By 1800, nearly 1 million Americans live west of the Appalachian crest. So in this map on this screen right here, orange, in the middle of that orange section, we have the Appalachians. And by 1800, 1 million had moved across that into Indian Territory and these Northwest territories. Now, the movement was encouraged by the federal government, particularly with the use of the U.S. Army to force out Native Americans. And then in 1803, Spain was forced by Napoleon to get rid of or to give up Louisiana, which threatened American commerce on the Mississippi River. Now, Jefferson offered to buy New Orleans from France to fix this problem. Now, Napoleon, suddenly needing money, offered to sell off all Louisiana to the United States, over 800,000 square miles. Now, Jefferson's quandary. How do we reconcile the purchase with strict construction of the Constitution? Nowhere in the Constitution does it list who and how land purchases are going to be made. So Jefferson has to make this decision. Remember, he is a strict constructionist. He believes in the word of the Constitution. Now, Jefferson decides to allow the voters to judge the constitutionality of the purchase in the 1804 presidential elections. So basically, he decides, he goes, okay, I will not decide to buy this, so I will purchase it, and then we'll let the people decide if that's really what they wanted. If they did, they'll vote for me. If they didn't, then that's the end of things. So that's basically his way of saying that this is true democracy at work. I, as president, am not deciding. The people will back this decision if they feel that I am the right person making the decision. Now, this westward expansion becomes very important in this time period. There were two forces that underlied the western expansion in the decades following the American Revolution. Yeoman farmers, both in the North and South, they tried to maintain their independence in the face of growing land scarcity on the eastern seaboard. And the movement of commercial agriculture, especially southern planters looking for fresh land. The boom in cotton in the early 1800s, after the invention of the cotton gin, spurred the movement of planters west as cotton quickly exhausted the soil. Now, federal land policy, which initially required large purchases for cash, meant that much of the western land ended up in the hands of speculators. Speculators found themselves having to deal with squatters, and then growing land scarcity, worn out land, and labor departed for the frontier forced eastern farmers to introduce progressive agricultural techniques. So we have new ways of farming, people on the move, mostly because of this farming and this agricultural boom, which remember was what Jefferson really, really wanted. Now, Jefferson was easily reelected in 1804, but afterwards his fortunes suffered. He had some political troubles. Now, his fallout with his vice president, Aaron Burr, who killed Hamilton in a duel, didn't really help matters. There was an ultra-pure faction within Jefferson's Republicans known as the Quids, which caused a lot of problems with anything that Jefferson maybe was moving more moderate that they didn't like. And shortly after his election, James Callender exposed Jefferson's sexual relationship with his slave, Sally Hemings. So almost everything that could possibly go wrong went wrong for Jefferson right off the bat in his second term. We also have this problem that shortly after the French were starting to lose, and they were still fighting with the British during this time period, and it looks like things aren't going too good for the French, and they kind of boost up with Napoleon. The British began stopping U.S. ships and forcing American sailors to serve in the Royal Navy, and this is known as impressment. Now, in 1806, the U.S. Congress passed the Non-Importation Act, which basically the U.S. resorted to trade pressure to end the British practice of impressment. So we're going to pass a law that we can't import stuff from Britain, with the hope that if we don't get too close to their ships, then they can't take our men. Now, in 1807, Congress also passed the Embargo Act, which, because of the failure of non-importation and the Chesapeake Affair and New England's resistance, it caused Jefferson to ask for a cessation of all U.S. imports and exports. So, the people who wanted to trade with England were the industrialists in the North and the capitalists in the North, and them not following the Non-Importation Act forced the United States to end all trade, period, with foreign nations, known as the Embargo Act. Now, shortly after Jefferson's problems and his issues with Britain and different things like that, James Madison followed Jefferson as president in March of 1809. Now, Jefferson left the presidency very unpopular because of his harsh and unsuccessful policies to end impressment. Now, Madison also failed to end impressment. He passed another Non-Intercourse Act in 1809, and then Macon's Bill No. 2 in 1810, which tried to alleviate some of the problems but didn't fix what was happening. Now, misunderstanding each other's views of the world and their place in it, between the British and the Americans wanted their neutral rights respected, while British and French thought weak nations like the U.S. must ally themselves with great powers for their own protection. And a group of men known as the War Hawks, which are people like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, pushed for war between America and Britain because they felt that it was the only way for the U.S. to reclaim its honor. So basically, this new nation, this new republic, just starting off, is now faced with these huge nations, and they feel that in order for the world to run smoothly, these huge nations have to work together. Now, on June 19th, 1812, war was declared between between Britain and the United States. Madison accused Britain of violating U.S. neutral rights, and it claimed that Britain was inciting Native Americans' attacks on the frontier, and some Americans coveted Canada. Now, the U.S. was divided on war, South and West pro-war, and New England anti-war, because mostly they had strong ties with the British Empire. Now, at the onset of the war, the U.S. was ill-prepared for war. Their navy was made up of 6 frigates, 3 sloops, and even with the use of privateers or privately paid men, not even close enough to the strength needed to take on the Royal Navy. The U.S. Army had never been larger than 3,500 during the war. Yet, the U.S. lack of preparation was offset for most of the war by the fact that the British were in 1812 still heavily engaged in their war with France. Now, this is going to bring us to the end of our lecture, and in the next discussion and the videos we'll be watching in class, I'm going to be talking about the War of 1812 and what it did to our nation and what it showed who we are as American citizens. And I hope you enjoyed today's lecture. This is Professor Hasselman for History 17A, and this was a lecture on the creation of the new republic.